Recently, I was the guest presenter for the Appalachian Heritage Week at John C. Campbell Folk School. A lot of you were not able, of course, to travel to Brasstown to hear my presentation. Some of you did. Thank you so much for coming. But those of you who could not, you asked me if I would do the presentations here on the channel so you could hear what I talked about too. So I'm going to try to do that. Today is the first one that I'm sharing, and it's about the rich, colorful language of Appalachia. Now I have my laptop right here, so if you notice me looking down, it's so that I can keep my train of thought. You know that all of you who watch my videos, you know I'm just plumb foolish about the language of Appalachia, and I'll go off on several squirrel trails if I don't stick to what I want to say, which I think is really important to celebrate our rich, colorful language. And I've been doing that for a long time, so I'm very passionate about it. So if you've never been to the mountains of Appalachia, maybe you've never heard the beautiful accent. If you have, then you're very familiar with it. I have a very strong mountain accent, so you're hearing it right now from me for sure. Now many people ask me, two questions I get asked a lot. One of them is the Appalachian accent the same, like say, in Virginia as it is in North Georgia, or even West Virginia, North Georgia, or various locations? A lot of people think it is. They're just hearing it and they think, yeah, sure it is. It's different. It varies from place to place. You have to really listen, but if you do, you can hear it. Also, I get asked a lot is, what's so special about the Appalachian accent? It's just like the Southern accent. It's the same thing. It's really not. There's definitely some crossover there, but when you think about the words and the phrases, and even the way maybe we say some things, but there's a lot of differences too. It is a different sound and a different language. Even the Deep South, the South, which I'm not as familiar with studying it as I am the language of Appalachia, there's variations on it. You can think of someone from maybe thinks of an accent that may be like Texas, then you think of Alabama, you think, I have some dear friends in South Carolina, I love to hear them talk, but they don't sound like me, they sound different. They have a beautiful accent, but it's not like what I sound like. I think language as a whole is just fascinating. There's so many different ways to look at it, so many things to study. It's just really, really unique, but I have primarily focused on the language of Appalachia. So I was born and raised, if you've watched all my videos, you already know this, right here in Brasstown, North Carolina, which is in the far western portion of North Carolina. And we never really traveled much when I was a child. We didn't go on big vacations or anything like that. If we did travel, it was only to see family, maybe 2 hours away. Maybe once or twice we went on a longer journey than that, but not very often. So I wasn't really exposed to other language, other accents, other than, of course, TV. TV is where I would hear people that sounded different than I do, different than I did in those days too. But when I was in college, one semester I needed an extra elective just to make up the credits that I needed. You know, I had a great counselor who helped me make sure I was getting everything, I was right on track so that I could graduate. And that semester, an Appalachian Studies class was offered. I would have never picked it out on my own. It's interesting how things like that happen. That class changed the whole rest of my life. But at that time, I still remember where I was sitting in the little office there with Dr. Wood, and he said, you should just take this. It's available, you need one. I said, sure, okay, I'll take it. I was an easy student, so I took it. Well, my professor, Mr. Cabe, it's interesting, Mr. Cabe lives just this way, over that ridge there in Pinhook, so we were sort of neighbors. Anyway, so he was my professor. Well, that class introduced me so much to the wonderful culture of Appalachia. Up until that point, as silly as it sounds, and I'd been out of high school for a while, so I was in my early 20s, I did not realize that the culture, thinking about the language, the food, the music, the folklore, all those things, I did not realize that any of that, the things that I had experienced, was not just the same across the whole United States. I know it sounds silly, doesn't it? I just had never really sat and thought about how we are different, we are unique, just like other cultures are. All cultures are wonderful. It's just that I only know about my own. It's the only one I can speak to. But all cultures are wonderful and beautiful. So that was when I first realized that. Now, Mr. Cabe, he had a real interesting thing. Once a week, he would have an Appalachian vocabulary test. Well, sometimes I didn't even need to study for the test because I knew all the words. Other times, I learned words that I was not familiar with. That's the wonderful thing about language I was talking about. It is ever-changing, and it's different. It's alive, really, language is, and it's different in different parts of the country, of the world, of course we know, but even in the mountains of Appalachia, it's different. Now, for more than a decade at this point in my life, I've talked about that rich language online, rich, colorful language of Appalachia. And during that time, I've had people tell me, you know, I live in Appalachia, and I've lived here my whole life, and I've never heard those words you talk about or those phrases. I've also had people say, I live in Idaho, California, different places like that, far away from the mountains of Appalachia, and I know all of those words, all of those phrases, and my family does too. I believe both those people are right. I believe that's it. I believe they're right. How could that possibly be true? Well, language is fluid, and as people move and travel, it goes with them. And especially when you think about the settlement of the United States, many of the words, the phrases, the pronunciations, that word in itself, I know I say funny, they came with the people from the British Isles and from different locations too, but predominantly here in southern Appalachia, many people who have been here for generations, they can trace their lineage back to those areas around the British Isles. Farther north, there's a German influence, and of course there's many others. But as that migration of people came from east to the west coast as they went across the United States, any place they stayed, and stayed for a long period of time, that language just stayed with them. It just stayed there. Now, I believe it stayed in the mountains of Appalachia at a higher rate because of a few different reasons. One is the isolated nature of the mountains themselves. Just kept more of the words and phrases alive than in other places. I think the very nature of Appalachian culture also played a role in that. Appalachians are born storytellers, and rich, colorful language always make a story better. But the mountains actually kept people in place for a variety of different reasons. I've talked about this in some of my videos. I have a video about sense of place that I really dig into that. But in days gone by, really the rough terrain, it's a very rough and rugged area, makes it hard to exit, hard to leave if you're thinking about walking or riding a horse or having mules pull a wagon. But also, people just really fell in love with the stunning landscape that can be seen in the Appalachian Mountains. And then there's the culture. Appalachian culture is a familial culture. Those close family ties. It's hard to leave your family, hard to leave the beauty, hard to leave because it was isolated. My own family line has been in the mountains of western North Carolina for over 12 generations. That's a lot of people staying in one kind of small geographical area, handing down that language to the next generation. But my family is not unique. There are many people who could say the same thing who live in the mountains of Appalachia. And with that much of a large population staying in the same place for those generation after generation, it ensured that the language just held on here more so than in other places. And when it comes to the distinct attributes of the Appalachian language, I like to divide them into like a couple of different areas. First are the old words that are still used even though they are considered archaic in other parts of the country. A few that come to mind is blaring your eyes, redding up the table or the house, somerset for turning a somersault. So blaring your eyes is like they kind of get big and look real intense. Sometimes when the girls were, I guess they were maybe tween age, kind of between just before being a teenager or early teenage years, I might ask them to do something and they'd give me a look. I'd say, "Don't blare your eyes at me, just go do what I told you to do." I had the same thing said to me when I was about that age. Red up the kitchen or the house just means pick up, clean, straighten up. And I can still hear, I got somerset from my father, Pap, I can still hear him just telling a story about somebody. Maybe it was, you know, his friend Eddie saying, and he got his feet in a tanglement as he was walking down through there, and he started falling, and before he fell, he had turned a somerset. It was the wildest or craziest thing I ever seen in my life. So that's a good one. That's an old one. There's also old sayings, and there's many more of those archaic words too. I could go on, and if you watch my videos, you know I could go on and on and on talking about them. And in fact, ever so often, I have a video where I go through the dictionary that has a lot of the words, one of the reference books that I use, so you could certainly watch those if you want to hear more of them. But there's also old sayings that have been passed down. We have a lot of colorful sayings, but one that comes to mind is one I learned actually from my mother-in-law, my husband's mother, Miss Cindy. A lot of you have heard me talk about Miss Cindy. And her family would say grab and growl just as a humorous call to come eat. To come eat, you know, supper's ready, dinner's ready, breakfast is ready. I really loved it and thought it was unique, but years later, after I was researching about the language of Appalachia, I learned that that's actually a phrase used throughout the mountains of Appalachia. It's not just common to Miss Cindy's family. And that phrase is actually a great example of language traveling along like I was talking about. Several years ago, a gentleman who lived in the Pacific Northwest, he contacted me to tell me about that phrase. His wife had always said it, as long as they'd been married, and he'd kind of teased her about it, and their children, as they got older, had teased her about it too. And he said, she always said, I'm not the only one that says it. You know, I didn't make it up. You know, she'd always kind of say the same thing. He said, well, today, our adult daughter come over to eat with us, and as usual, my wife said grab and growl, and as usual, we teased her about it. And as usual, she said, I'm not the only one that says it. He said, so I thought I'm finally going to find out. And he went to the computer and, you know, did an internet search, and he found me talking about grab and growl. So he said, after all these years, I know my wife was exactly right. You know, she was right. She was telling the truth, and she had not made it up. But what I found especially interesting was he shared a little bit about her life, and her grandparents had come from the mountains of Appalachia. They had settled out there, and then of course raised their family. Then I don't know if it was her, you know, her mother's parents or her father's parents, but either way, then they had raised her, and that language had been passed down in their family. There's also, thinking about another distinct attribute, there's the noticeable words outside of normal syntax. A couple of examples, and again, if you've watched my videos any length of time, I know you've heard me say these because I say them all the time, is we say ever when for whenever, ever how for however. Another one is really confusing to people, and it's I don't care to. Sounds like you don't want to do it. I don't care to do that. But actually it means I'll be glad to. I don't mind. I don't care to do that. I'd be glad to do it. When I was in high school, I worked at Cato's. It's like a women's fashion store that's popular in our area or throughout I don't know how far Cato's goes, but I know throughout the South anyway. And my boss there at the time, she had moved to our area because her husband had been transferred to our area to manage a plant. And she told me when she first come, she had to learn what people meant by what they said because she was not familiar with the way that we speak. And she lived in another unique example for locals here. She lived in Fires Creek, but locals would say Fireses Creek. So she lived in Fireses Creek, and she had met her neighbor lady and had kind of tried to make friends with her, and you know that was how she learned a lot of the language. But she said one day, right there at Fireses Creek, there's a little Hills grocery store there. It's really just a gas station, and she was there with her doing whatever she needed to do, and the neighbor lady just happened to be there too, and she seen her, and she said, hey, you know, good to see you. I'm going to go into town, into Hayesville, and eat lunch. Would you like to go with me? And her neighbor lady said, I don't care to. And my boss said, she said, okay, see you later, and drove off, you know, and left her. And she said then it was a few weeks later she run into her, and she said, why did you drive off and leave me? I was going to go with you to eat lunch. And she said, well, you said you didn't care to. And she said, yeah, I mean, I didn't care to. Of course, I wanted to go. So that's just a little unique story, but that's one that can be confusing. And if you've done any kind of research about language in Appalachia or even in the South, that's one that will often be talked about. Another lady I worked with in later years, she told me when she first moved to the area, one that really confused her is that if somebody would say to her, do what? And we say do what to mean, what did you say? Excuse me, I didn't hear you, all those things. But instead we would just say, do what? Do what? And she said, I would find myself looking around like, I'm not sure what you want me to do, but I'll do it if you just tell me. I don't understand, you know. So she said it took her a while to understand that one. Some unique language usages are simply mispronunciations of the word, yet they are so widely used that they are notable as part of the language as a whole. A few examples would be the way we change words that end with OW to end in either an ER or an A. So think of pillow, but becomes pillar or pilla, window, winder, or winda. I'm of the A variety on that. I say the A's. Then, you know, there's the way we say the words. Sometimes we shorten them. Often we add another syllable or two or three. Leaving the G off of words is very common. Instead of running, running. Instead of swimming, swimming. And we're bad to leave off the S of measurements. So instead of 50 miles, you might hear it's 50 mile away. Or that pumpkin I grew this year weighed 20 pounds. Or even when I had the girls, I was 26-year-old. Har is another good example. It's actually harrow, as in harrowing the garden. Years ago, a lady told me that she was teaching remedial reading in a high school here in western North Carolina, and the student bogged down on the word harrow, and she said, you know what that is, to try to give a hint. The triangular thing with teeth that you drag across a field to smooth it. And he said, you mean a har? She said, yes. So I was just like him. I didn't realize that har was not a word until I was grown. I would have never connected that on my own to harrow. My mother-in-law, she told me she wasn't familiar with it either. And one time her father-in-law told her he needed to get the garden hard. And she said, what does that mean? And he said, cut, you know, cut. And she said, well, what does that mean? And he said, you know, hard. She said, well, I realized that could go on all day, so I decided to wait and ask my husband when he got home to explain it. But even within those two examples, there's something really interesting for someone like me that's crazy about language. In Madison County, they used har to mean to smooth out the field before planting. In Haywood County, which is fairly close to Madison County, I guess a county between them, and then here in Cherokee County where I'm at, har would mean the same thing it did in Haywood County, would mean to cut. So really to turn over deep the field, to turn it over. A lot of times if you live in an area where there's a lot of agriculture, in early spring, late winter, you might go by and you notice a field that has just been there, you know, laying there with nothing on it, has been hard, it's been turned over deep. So that's interesting, and that's very common in Appalachia, that a word that means something in one area may mean something else in another area. Often you'll hear a sneaky T added to words, onced, twiced, across. Other times it's an extra R that's added. Wash becomes wash. You might hear that one, wash. And we don't say ruin or ruined, we say runt. So that runt has the extra R and the T on the end of it. Other words we make longer. Thinking about gown, like your nightgown, you might hear gowned, gowned. You've got to put that on it. Drown becomes drowned, drowned. Striped becomes stripedy. Emphasis is really important in the Appalachian language. Sometimes we add extra words just to make our point. We throw the word big or biggest into a sentence. A big part of the problem is there's too many hens in the hen house. least means small or little, but sometimes we'll use both those words for emphasis. I saw the least little carvings in the wood carving class when I was at the folk school giving these presentations. I saw them. They were just tiny, just the least little ones. They were adorable. We also use good, awful, and bad in that same manner to show emphasis. And strangely, we use awful and bad, which have negative connotations, in a positive way. Last night for supper, we had fresh roasting ears, tomatoes straight from the vine, and it was just awful good. He's bad to sit up half the night picking the guitar, but that's why he's got so good at it. We love to add EST as an ending to words to emphasize how good someone is at something. So she might be the singingest, the swimmingest, the cryingest, the worryingest, the aggravatingest, or the fightingest girl you ever seen. We also add IFTIED as a suffix. Examples: fightified, prettified, and if you're townified, you're no longer countryfied. Sometimes we add the word like. If you go in there careful like, you won't wake the baby. If you go in there careless like, you're going to wake the baby and he's not going to get his nap out. Set that bucket down easy like, and you won't get kicked before you start milking. I thought he was asleep, but sudden like he jumped up and ran outside. And just to muddy the waters even more, sometimes we use the completely wrong word. One that I often get teased about is using ideal for idea. And again, it's not just me saying it wrong. That's documented throughout the Appalachian Mountains as a real, it occurs so often that it becomes part of the notable things about the language, like something that people could point to and say that's part of the particulars of the Appalachian language. We say ivy for mountain laurel and laurel for rhododendron. Bob Dulcimer, he was a long-time director of music and dance at the John C. Campbell Folk School, and a dear, dear family friend, still is. We just don't get to see Bob as much. But he one time shared a quote with me about ivy from ballad collector Cecil Sharp with me. It is quite in accordance with the habit of the mountaineer to call things by their wrong names. Laurel for rhododendron, ivy for laurel, vine for ivy, and biscuit for scone. Cecil Sharp visited the mountains of Appalachia in about 1916, and even his very name is said differently in parts of Appalachia. Bob would say Cecil Sharp. I say Cecil. My daddy had a cousin, lived right down the road here in Brasstown, and his name was Cecil. So I'm very partial. You've probably, even if you've never watched any of my videos before today, and if you have, you already know this, but I'm very partial to the language of Appalachia. I love the way we say the words, the colorful phrases, the way it sounds on the ear. I love it because it speaks of home to me, but not everyone does. People who sound like me often get belittled for being uneducated and unintelligent. And of course, it's not just the Appalachian accent that's stereotyped. Any accent that doesn't sound like mainstream or Main Street USA can be maligned. Many years ago, my daughters, Katie and Corey, had a school trip to the Outer Banks, and I went with them. And one of the days we were going to get to go across and see the wild ponies. It was really a spring day, like a March spring day, just immediately what comes to mind with the whipping wind howling through the areas. So at first it looked like the trip was going to be canceled. The waves were just too rough for people to be on. But finally we got the all clear and we were going to go, and about partway across we all had to go inside because it was just so rough, the water, which was really scary for us. We'd never been on a boat that big or in water that rough. But we got to a better place and things calmed down and they let us go back out, and we were sitting like up against the wall there on a bench, me and Katie and Corey, and kind of still being scared from that little rough water. But we were enjoying the views, beautiful and so different than what we were used to, here in the mountains. And I noticed a man down the way working, one of the sailors, and he kept kind of looking up there at us, and I could hear a bit of what he was saying. And I told the girls, I said, I think that gentleman is making fun of us. Of course, we would never have said nothing to him, but I said, I think he's making fun of how we talk. And in a few minutes, he kept watching us. He come up there and started talking to us. He wanted to know where we were from, and we told him. And he said, and immediately I knew he wasn't making fun of us. He just had a unique accent. He said, I thought that you and your daughters were making fun of how I talk. And I started laughing, me and the girls did. I said, we thought you were making fun of how we talk, which was really, we both got a good laugh out of that. But it turned out we were from far western North Carolina. Well, he was from one of the islands, Ocracoke, I think. So he had a very unique accent. And there was little pieces of it that I thought he was trying to sound like us, but it was not like our accent. I just thought he was trying to imitate it. Anyway, it's a very unique experience, and we both enjoyed it. He did, and we did too. So over the years, though, of talking about my Appalachian accent, I've had several people tell me they thought I was perpetuating bad grammar and butchering the English language, and they sure wouldn't want their children to speak like me. They prefer everyone sounds the same, like textbook English, grammar perfect, all that. And I really wouldn't argue with them that I certainly don't speak textbook English, but I would say that some of the way we speak predates today's modern way of speaking. In 1913, the Merriam-Webster International Dictionary had an entry for ivy and ivy tree, with the description being what today is commonly called mountain laurel. Appalachians, like my family, who use ivy to describe the beautiful, stunning plant that surrounds my mountain holler, have actually just retained its original meaning. You can go back and see some of my videos. We have ivy and laurel mixed together, growing all the way around my house. It's beautiful. I'm encircled by that beauty every year. It's wonderful. And although there are people that would be embarrassed to sound like me and think I'm, passing on bad habits and nobody's going to take us seriously and we'll never amount to anything and all that kind of stuff, there are many more people who really love the Appalachian accent. When my oldest nephew went off to college up north, he'd never been that far away from home. We'd never been that far away from him. So, of course, we were all worried about him, especially Granny. And when he first got to come home that year, probably Christmas maybe, she told him about how worried she'd been about him. And he said, "Oh, Granny," he said, "don't worry about me." He said, "They are all real nice to me." And he said, "They really like me because they like to hear me talk, especially the girls," he said. So we all got a good laugh out of that. People who have a connection to Appalachia really appreciate the accent, like I was saying, even myself, because it kind of speaks of home or of good times, good memories, maybe their grandparents or something like that. My good friend, Lonnie Dockery, he was actually related to me too, we found out years later, but I first worked for him at the college. That's how I met him. He told me this story. He was crazy about our Appalachian mountains too, and he grew up that way over those mountain ridges in Pine Log. But when he was grown, he joined the Marines and ended up staying in the Marines until he retired, and so he didn't get to come home very often. And he told me one time it'd been a long time since he got to come home, and he was just really homesick, and he was wishing he could sit at his mama's kitchen table and drink coffee and just listen to her talk about whatever had been going on in the community. So he was on a trip, and he had a layover in California somewhere, and so he's at the airport kind of feeling sorry for himself, and he said he noticed a gentleman sitting across the way from him, and he had a duffel bag, and Lonnie could see, and the duffel bag was unzipped, and there was a jar of syrup kind of sticking out. And so he said, and if you don't know what syrup is, in the mountains of Appalachia, many people grow sorghum cane, and they make syrup from it. Some people call that sorghum syrup. Some people call it sorghum molasses. Some people call it just molasses. My family and Lonnie's family just called it syrup, like there could be no other. It was just that. It was syrup. Anyway, he said he sidled over to the gentleman and said, I see you got some syrup there. Well, as soon as the man started talking, right away it's obvious he was from the mountains of Appalachia, not from where we're at, but from the general area. And so Lonnie said me and him talked until it was time for us to part ways, and he said that he just gave me that little piece of home that I needed to get over feeling sorry for myself and being real homesick. And he said I never forgot that. And I told Lonnie, I would tell Lonnie if I could. I've never forgot it either since you told me that story, and I'm so glad you did. So early in my career of celebrating all things Appalachian, on my blog, Blind Pig and the Acorn, I met a woman online, and she told me a real bittersweet story about her father. She was born and raised in Oregon, and her mother and father had a real difficult relationship. He was a heavy drinker. There was a lot of fighting and bad times, and he died when she was fairly young. And her mother never told her much about him. She never knew much about him because, of course, as she grew up, he was no longer part of her life. Well, when she was in college, she was in a group that come to Kentucky to do mission work. And she said, we were driving around these mountain roads, we got lost, and we couldn't find our way, and we finally decided we was going to have to stop and ask somebody if they could tell us where to go. She said, so we saw this gentleman on the side of the road, and we stopped, and whoever was driving or whatever asked him if he could help them with directions, and he said sure. But she said when he started talking, if I hadn't been like, the door hadn't been holding me in, I would have fell out of the car. It was just like hearing my father's voice come out of his mouth. So she went home after that trip and began to research and found out her father was indeed from the mountains of Appalachia. And that's in fact why she followed me, was because she thought maybe he grew up similar to how I lived. That maybe that give her a peek into his past, since she knew so very little about him. The Appalachian vocabulary, words, phrases, and usages, and all that play a prominent role in my videos. If you watch me here on YouTube, you know that. But as well as my writings, one of my greatest achievements, really the best thing as far as my work really makes me happy, is that my blog, Blind Pig and the Acorn, was used as a source in the Dictionary of Southern Appalachian English. And that was compiled by Michael Montgomery and Jennifer Heinmiller. But Michael died while he was doing that book. Now, he had already produced the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English, but this was his second work. He is prolific, too. There's other books he wrote about, I can't think of the name of it, but one about the Scots Ulster, I think is the name of the book, something like that. You could search his name and find it, I'm sure. Anyway, he died while he was doing the book of Southern Appalachian Dictionary of Southern Appalachian English, and Jennifer had to finish it, and I'm so glad, so thankful that she did. But my blog is used as a reference in there, and that's just wonderful. Nearly 4 million people have watched one of my videos here on YouTube about Appalachian language. And for over 15 years on the blog, I've shared a monthly Appalachian vocabulary test in the same way that Mr. Cabe did all those years ago. I could go on talking about the rich, colorful language of Appalachia for days. If you watch me and you followed me here on YouTube, you know that. I think I just had a friend fly into my hair. If you see it crawling around, that's what it is. But I'll quit right there. I've probably told you more than you needed to know. There is another little portion of the presentation that I did that night about language. It's more of a slideshow, so I'll share that in a week or two here on YouTube just as a standalone kind of short little video to let you see some of the words and phrases, have some pictures to go along with it. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that maybe I broadened your knowledge of Appalachian language. Maybe you enjoyed thinking about people you know who have that accent. Maybe it made you a little bit proud. Not that we're better than anybody else. I always like to preface that. But proud in the way that Appalachians use that word, is really pleased. Maybe it makes you pleased to sound the way that you do. I'm getting rained on, so I'm going to have to end right here. But I'm always glad when you stop by to help me celebrate Appalachia. And I really appreciate every one of you for helping me with that endeavor.